A Daughter of the Samurai. Chapter 8. Two Ventures. My brother's coming introduced an entirely new and exciting element into our home. This was the letters which he occasionally received from his friends in America. The letters were dull, for they told of nothing but people and business. So after the first few, I lost all interest in them. But the big odd-shaped envelopes and the short pages of thick paper covered with faint pen writing held a wonderful fascination. None of us had ever seen a pen or any kind of writing paper except our rolls of thin paper with the narrow envelopes. We could write a letter of any length, sometimes several feet, on that paper. We began at the right side and, using a brush, wrote in vertical lines, unrolling from the left as we wrote. The graceful black characters standing out against a background, all white, but shaded by the varying thicknesses of the paper into a mass of delicate misty blossoms, were very artistic. In later years, we had flowered paper in colours, but when I was a child, only white was considered dignified. Brother always used the large, odd-shaped envelopes for letters to America, so I suppose that kind was necessary. One day he asked me to hand to the postman a letter enclosed in one of our narrow envelopes, embossed with a graceful branch of maple leaves. I was greatly surprised when I saw that it had an expensive stamp on the corner and was addressed to America. "Honourable brother," I hesitatingly asked, "will government allow this letter to go?" "Why not?" I thought only big envelopes could be used for letters to America. "Nonsense," he said crossly, and then he added in a kind tone, "I haven't any more, and those I sent to Tokyo haven't come." And so the delicate maple leaves went to America, and my girlish heart was pleased. It was the first pleasant bond between the two countries of which I had known. There was nothing definite in my mind against America, but I was so constantly hearing allusions to the disagreeable experiences of almost all persons who had dealings with foreigners that I had a vague feeling of distaste for the unknown land. This impression was strengthened by odd stories told by servants of red-faced, light-haired barbarians who had no heels and had to prop up their shoes with artificial blocks. It was said that animals were eaten whole by these strange people, and that the master of a lordly house often entertained his guests by cutting up a cooked eagle in their presence. It was also rumoured that the cheap red blankets extensively imported at that time were dyed with the blood of stolen infants. One report, which was widespread in city and country alike, was that the peculiar animal odour of foreigners was caused by the eating of flesh. This probably originated from the unfamiliar odour of wool noticed in the damp clothing of foreign sailors. Since we had neither sheep nor woolen cloth in Japan, the unfamiliar odour was naturally associated with the person who carried the scent about with him. The name has clung, and even yet it is not uncommon for country people inquiring in a store for woolen cloth to ask for animal-smelling goods. Brother denied very few of these tales. I think many of them he believed, even having lived in America. Apparently he had met while there very few people except those engaged in buying and selling. Once grandmother said with a sigh, "Your honourable brother seems to have learned only the ways of tradesmen in faraway America. But," she added thoughtfully, "perhaps it is a land where only tradesmen live." He had been to America, but we did not realize that he had seen only one small portion of one coast city in that great land. As time passed on, Brother seemed to withdraw from our family life, and yet he did not fall into the life of the people of Nagaoka. He was different from everybody. Sometimes he looked troubled and anxious, but more often he was only restless and dissatisfied. At such times he frequently came and sat beside me as I sewed or studied, and I think he talked more freely to me than to anyone else. Occasionally, though not often, he spoke of himself, and gradually I learned much of what his life had been since he left home. His going to America was due to the craze for foreign business which had struck Tokyo so forcefully about the time Brother left the army. Many young men, confident of rapid and brilliant success, were launching out in various directions, and someone induced Brother to invest all he had in what was represented to be a large export company having offices in America. He was offered a partnership if he would take charge of the business there. Like most men of his rank, he had no realization of his own ignorance of business methods, so he accepted and set sail for America. On reaching his destination, he found that he had been defrauded. The export company was only a small toy shop situated in a crowded Japanese district and kept by the wife of a workman who knew nothing of the promised partnership. Astonished and disappointed, Brother made his way to a nearby hotel. A pretty poor place, he said, where many Japanese men were talking and playing games. They were mostly workmen or cheap clerks of a humble class with almost no education, but they were most respectful to him, and though the surroundings were uncongenial, he knew no other place to go. In a short time he had spent all his money, and, knowing nothing of any kind of work and almost nothing of the English language, he easily drifted downwards into the life of those around him. Some men would have pushed up through the mud and found light, but my brother knew little of foreigners. He had no ambitions regarding them, and what he saw of them, where he was, only repelled him. Sometimes he left the crowded district where he lived and strolled through wide streets where there were tall buildings and big stores. There he saw foreign people, but they either paid no attention to him or looked at him as he himself would look at an unskilled labourer at home. This amused him, for to him the strange-looking men who hurried by him, talking in loud voices and smoking large, ill-smelling tobacco rolls or chewing horrible stuff that they blew out of their mouths onto the street, were wholly disgusting. The women were queerly dressed creatures who stared and laughed with their mouths open. Nothing seemed delicate or refined, only big and strong and coarse. Everything repelled his artistic soul, so he drifted back to his uncongenial but understandable surroundings. Then fate stepped in. My brother was hurt by an accidental blow on the head, which sent him to a hospital for 3 blessed, cool, clean weeks. The day he was dismissed and, sick at heart, was slowly walking towards the only place he knew to go, his old quarters, he turned a corner and suddenly came face to face with a young man, vigorous and brisk, walking with a quick step. The man laughed aloud as both abruptly came to a standstill. Then, seeing how pale and ill Brother looked, he turned and walked with him. However shabbily my brother might be dressed, he always had the bearing of a gentleman, and recognizing this, the young man, whose name was Matsuo, insisted on taking Brother to his own room. A few days later he found a place for him in a store where he himself was foreman, and the acquaintance thus ripened into a warm and lasting friendship. Had this help been given when brother first reached America, the high-bred, delicately reared youth, although overindulged and unwisely trained for practical life, might have won his puzzling way through all the strangeness. But it was now too late. That accidental blow on the head had caused a damage which, though not apparent at first, gradually developed into a trouble that unfitted him for steady work, and my poor brother was never the same again. But Matsuo was steadfastly kind. Then came a message from Major Sato in Tokyo, saying father was ill and wanted his son to return home. Of what was in my brother's heart then I knew nothing, but for many weeks he delayed his reply. Then he came. That autumn, our year of mourning was over, and brother, being home to take that place of father's, sister's marriage was planned for harvest time. The season, however, was early. Rice patches throughout Etsuko were bowing with rich promise early in October, but of course nobody was ever married in the no-God months. So the first good luck day in November was chosen. It is during October that the marriage gods all meet in Etsuko Temple to join the names of those who are to wed. One of the favourite stories for grandmothers and nurses to tell little girls is about a youth of olden times who was so unfortunate as to have no parents or elder brother. There being no one to arrange a marriage for him, he grew to the age of 20 and was still a bachelor. One October day, he decided to visit Etsuko Temple to see if his name was coupled with that of any maiden. So, taking with him, as a gift, the first rice sheaf of his harvest, he started on his long day's journey. As he approached the temple steps, he heard voices. Names were being called, like counting. He, she, he, she. He recognized the name of a young man he knew, then another and another, each paired off with the name of a young woman. "Ma," whispered the astonished youth, "I have intruded upon a meeting of the gods." But his interest was too great to allow him to retreat. Creeping between the ornamental posts that supported the floor, he listened guiltily, but with anxious hope. Another 2 names, another, he, she, but alas, not his own. Finally, a voice of authority announced, "These are planned. Our last day is almost gone, and our work for the year is ended." "Wait a moment," said another voice. "There is Taro. Again he is left. Cannot we find a maiden for him?" The youth's heart gave a bound, for he was Taro. "Oh, troublesome," impatiently cried a god. "Again comes that name." "We need not haste. He has no one to arrange for him," said another. "His name must go uncoupled for another year," came from a distant corner. "There is no maiden left." "Wait," spoke the first voice. "In Chestnut Village, a girl has just been born in the house of the village master. The family is of higher class, but let us give her to Taro. Then our work will be done." "Yes, yes," cried all the gods. "Put the names together and we will hasten to the duties of our own shrines. Our work of the year is ended," spoke the voice of authority. The youth crept away, excited and indignant, and sorely disappointed. As he trudged slowly along the road on his homeward way, both disappointment and indignation grew, but when he came in sight of Chestnut Village and saw the comfortable house of the village master with its thick thatch and large heavy screen with drying sheafs of rice, his anger lessened and he thought, "After all, it is not so bad." He walked slowly by the open door. A child's bed of cushions was just within. He saw a baby's face and a tiny close-shut hand. 12 years at least to wait," he cried suddenly. I will not have it so. I will defy the gods. On the tokonoma was a sword rest holding the single sword of a humble vassal. Grasping it, he made a quick thrust through the cushions, and bounding through the door, he hurried on his way. Years passed, fate was kind, and Taro prospered, but no bride could he find. More years passed, at last patiently accepting bachelorhood as a punishment for his defiance of the gods. He became resigned. Then a surprising thing happened. A go-between called with the offer of a bride, beautiful, industrious, dutiful. Taro was delighted. Negotiations were carried through. The bride came, the marriage took place, and the young wife proved all that the happy Taro could wish. One warm day when she was sewing on the porch, she loosened her collar folds, and Taro saw an odd curving scar on her neck. "What is that?" he asked. "That is a strange mystery," said the bride, smiling. "When I was only a babe, my grandmother heard me cry, and coming, found my father's sword on the floor, and I with this curving cut across my neck and shoulder. No one was near, and it was never learned how it happened. My grandmother said that I was marked by the gods for some wise purpose, and so it must be," concluded the wife as she leaned again over her sewing. Taro walked thoughtfully away. Again he saw the baby face and the tiny close-shut hand, and he realized how hopeless it is to try to thwart the decree of the gods. When Ishi told us this story, she always closed with, "And so you see it is useless not to accept gratefully the will of the gods. What is planned must be obeyed." When the day of Sister's wedding came, we were greatly excited. But the real excitement of a Japanese marriage is at the house of the bridegroom, as it is there that the wedding takes place. However, the ceremony of leaving home is always elaborate, and for several days our entire house was filled with the sound of people ordering and people obeying. Then came a day when Taki, Ishi, and Toshi were busy for hours, all three folding bedding and packing bridal chests. And the next day the procession of bridal belongings went swinging out of our gateway and on over the mountain to Sister's home-to-be. 2 days later, Sister went away. The hairdresser came very early that morning, for the bride's hair had to be arranged in the elaborate married style with wonderful ornaments of tortoiseshell and coral. Then her face and neck were covered with thick white powder, and she was dressed in a robe and sash of white, the death colour, because marriage means the bride's death to her father's family. Beneath this was a garment of scarlet, the dress of a newborn babe, typical of her birth into her husband's family. Mother had on her beautiful crest dress, and brother looked like father in the ceremonious pleated linen skirt and stiff shoulder piece of the kamishimo. I was so glad to see him look like father. Just as the bridal palanquin was brought to the door, we all went to the shrine for Sister to say farewell to the spirit of our ancestors, for after marriage she would belong no longer to our family but to her husband's. She bowed alone before the shrine. Then Mother slipped over the mat to her side and presented her with a beautiful mirror case, the kind that all Japanese ladies wear with ceremonial dress. Sister's was beautiful mosaic work of crepe in a pattern of pine, bamboo, and plum. It had been made by our great-grandmother's own hands. Inside it was a small mirror. A brocade-covered crystal hung from it on a silk cord, and on the edge of the case, slipped under the band was a long silver hairpin. In olden days, this was a dagger. These are emblematic of the mirror, the jewel, and the sword of the imperial regalia. As Mother handed the mirror case to Sister, she said the same words that every mother says to a bride. She told her that now she was to go forth bravely to her new life, just as a soldier goes to battle. Look in the mirror every day, she said, for if scars of selfishness or pride are in the heart, they will grow into the lines of the face. Watch closely, be strong like the pine, yield in gentle obedience like the swaying bamboo, and yet like the fragrant plum blossoming beneath the snow. Never lose the gentle perseverance of loyal womanhood. I never saw my mother so moved, but poor Sister looked only blank and expressionless beneath the stiff white powder. We all bowed deeply at the door. Sister entered the palanquin, and the next moment was hidden behind the reed screen of the little window. Her own nurse, who should have come next, had married and gone far away, so Ishi took her place and entered the first jinriksha. The go-between and his wife were in the next two, and then came brother and mother. The procession started. Toshi sprinkled salt on the doorstep, just as if a corpse had been carried out, and mingled with the sound of rolling wheels and the soft thud of trotting feet came grandmother's trembly old voice, singing the farewell part of the wedding song. From the shore, a boat with lifted sail rides towards the rising moon. On waves of ebbing tide it sails. The shadow of the land falls backwards, and the boats sail farther, farther. So ended Sister's life as an inagaki. For, however often she might visit us after that, and however lovingly and informally she might be treated, she would never again be anything but a guest. Long afterwards, Sister told me of her trip to her new home. It was only a few hours long, but she had to go over a mountain, and the palanquin jolted fearfully. She said her greatest anxiety was to keep her head, laden with heavy shell bars, from bumping against the cushions and disarranging her elaborately dressed hair. Finally, the carriers were trotting along evenly on a smooth road, and they came to a stop, and Ishi pushed up the reed screen of the window. Young mistress, she said, we have reached the halting place where we are to rest before presenting ourselves to the house of the honourable bridegroom. Mother and Ishi helped Sister out, and they all went into a good-sized but simple farmhouse. They were received most graciously by the hostess, who was a distant relative of the bridegroom's family. There they had dinner, each person being served with red rice and a small fish, head and all, meaning congratulations. Ishi freshened up Sister's dress, looked over her sash, examined her hair, and retouched her powdered face. Then the procession moved slowly on up a long sloping hill. At the top they were met by the 7.5 times courier, and soon reaching the big gateway with its crest banner and lanterns of welcome, she was conscious of being on a stone path when the carriers placed the palanquin on the ground. She could see nothing, but she knew that in a moment the little window in the front would be opened and the bridegroom's face would appear. Then he would strike the top of the palanquin with his fan, which would mean welcome. There was usually no delay, but this bridegroom was a bashful youth, only 17, and they had to go for him. Sister said that in those few minutes of waiting, she for the first time was frightened. Then she heard swift footsteps, and the next moment the little reed screen was jerked open. She ought to have sat quietly with her eyes cast modestly down, but she was startled and gave one quick glance upwards. In that instant's time she saw a pale, pock-marked face with a broad, low brow and close-pressed lips. Down went the screen, and without a second pause, clap, clap, came a nervous slap of the fan above her head. The palanquin was lifted and carried to the door. Sister within sat strangely calm, for in that instant of lifted screen her fright had slipped away forever. The door was reached, the palanquin was lowered to the ground. Sister was helped out, and as she entered her life home, two old voices completed the wedding song with the words of welcome. On the sea, a boat with lifted sail rides towards the rising moon. On the waves of the flowing tide it comes, the shadow of a past lies far behind, and the boat sailed nearer, nearer to the shores called Happy Life. Chapter 9. The Story of a Marionette. On the first day of Urabon, when I was 12 years old, Ishi bought a new ornament for my hair and placed it just in front of my big stand-up bow knot. It was a silver shield set in a mass of small loose silver flowers and looked very beautiful against the shiny black background. It was sent to you by Honourable Yido grandmother, she said. She had it made from melted ancient coins, and it is very wonderful. I turned my face in the direction of Tokyo and bowed a silent thank you to the kind invisible donor. Just who Honourable Yido grandmother was, I did not know. Each year, ever since I could remember, I had received a beautiful gift from her from our midsummer festival of Urabon, and, in a vague way, I was conscious that our family had some close connection with her, but I gave it no thought. All little girls have grandmothers. Some had two and some still more. Of course, grandmothers on mother's side lived elsewhere, but it was not unusual for a father to have both his mother and grandmother living in his home. Old people were always welcome, their presence giving dignity to the family. The house of a son who had the care of 3 generations of a parent was called the honoured seat of the aged. Urabon, a welcome to souls returned, was our festival to celebrate the annual visit of Oshorai, summer, a term used to represent the combined spirits of all our ancestors. It was the most dearly loved of our festivals, for we believe that our ancestors never lost their loving interest in us, and this yearly visit kept fresh in our hearts a cheerful and affectionate nearness to the dear ones gone. In preparing for the arrival of Oshorai summer, the only standards were cleanliness and simplicity, everything being done in an odd primitive fashion, not elaborated, even in the slightest degree from Bon festivals of the most ancient time. For several days everyone had been busy. Gia and another man had trimmed the trees and hedges, had swept all the ground, even under the house, and had carefully washed off the stepping stones in the garden. The floor mats were taken out and whipped dustless with bamboo switches. Kin and Toshi, in the meantime, making the air resound with the pata-pata-pata of paper dusters against the shoji, and the long-drawn-out siwishi of steaming hot padded cloths pushed up and down the polished porch floors. All the woodwork in the house, the broad ceiling boards, the hundreds of tiny white bars crossing the paper doors, the carved ventilators and the mirror-like post and platform of the tokonomas, was wiped off with hot water. Then every little broken place in the rice paper shoji was mended, And finally, the entire house, from thatch to the underfloor icebox, was as fresh and clean as rainwater falling from the sky. Mother brought from the gods down a rare old kakimono, one of Father's treasures, and after it was hung, Kin placed beneath it our handsomest bronze vase, holding a big loose bunch of 7 grasses of autumn: Althea, Pampas, Convolvulus, Wild Pink, and 3 kinds of asters, purple, yellow, and white. These are mostly flowers, but Japanese designate all plants that grow from the ground in slender, blade-like leaves as grasses. The shrine was, of course, the most important of all, as it was where the spirit guests lived during the day of the visit. Gia had gone to the pond before dawn to get lotus blossoms, for it is only with the first rays of sunrise that the puff comes off, which opens the pale green buds into snowy beauty. Before he returned, the shrine had been emptied and cleaned, and the bronze Buddha reverentially dusted and returned to his place on the gilded lotus. The tablet holding the ancestors' names and Father's picture, which Mother always kept in the shrine, were wiped off carefully, the brass open-work everlasting light lantern filled afresh with rapeseed oil, the incense burner, the candle stands, the sacred books, and our rosaries, all arranged in place, and the ugly fish-mouth wooden drum, which is typical of women's submissive position, rubbed until the worn place on the red lacquer was a shiny brown. Then Gia covered the floor before the shrine with a fresh, rudely woven map of pampas grass, and placed on either side a vase holding bunches of the 7 grasses of autumn. But the most interesting time of all came when Honourable Grandmother and I sat down before the shrine to prepare the decorations of welcome. I always loved to help her do this. Ishi and Toshi bought us some odd-shaped vegetables they'd found in the garden, a handful of dried hemp seeds from which the bark had been removed, and yards of somen, a sort of pliable macaroni. Honourable Grandmother took a crooked-necked cucumber, one end of which was shaped something like a lifted head, and made it into a horse, using corn silk for the mane and tail and hemp stems for stiff little legs. Of a small plump eggplant, she made a water buffalo with horns and legs of hemp stems, and twisting some half-dried salmon into harness for both little animals, she placed them in the shrine. I made several horses and buffaloes too. While we were working, Gia came in with some small lotus leaves, the edges of which were beginning to dry and turn up, like curved dishes, and a few very small yellow and red balls, a new kind of fruit which I now know were tomatoes. After Ishi had filled the lotus leaf dishes with vegetables and every kind of fruit, except the furry peach, Honourable Grandmother looped the salmon across the top of the shrine in a series of graceful festoons, hanging on it at intervals with small purple eggplants and the tiny yellow and red tomatoes. Then Ishi bought the kitchen row of steps, and climbing up hung the white bon lanterns high above everything. It was only a white paper cube twisted about with braid of paper having loose ends, but when it was lighted the heat made it constantly whirl, and the many ends of paper rising, falling and waving looked like a flock of tiny fluttering birds. It was very beautiful. The meaning of the decoration and the queer little vegetable animals has been lost in the midst of past years, but the lotus leaf shape of the dishes was because the lotus is a sacred flower. The Buddhist Bible tells the story of Buddha's time of temptation when he was living as a hermit on the Mount of Snow. One day, at the hour of dawn, he was sitting in meditation when he heard a strange, sweet song. As he listened, wonder and joy crept into his heart, for in it the notes of the melody were slowly unfolding the plan of salvation. Suddenly it ceased. In vain he waited. All was silence. Hurrying to the edge of a precipice, he peered into the midst of the valley, and there saw a horrible demon who had turned a taunting face towards the disappointed and anxious prophet. Earnestly the Buddha begged for the remainder of the song, but the demon said that he could sing no more until his hunger was satisfied with human flesh and his thirst with human blood. Then would he sing the mystic plan, until the knowledge of salvation had reached all humankind. The Buddha's dearest vision, that he himself should bring the message to the world, faded into nothingness, and eagerly he cried, "Satisfy thy hunger with my flesh and quench thy thirst with my blood, but continue thy song until every soul is saved." And casting off his robe, he sprang from the rock. A sudden gleam of sunshine lighted the valley and touched the waters of a pool where was floating a lotus with spreading leaves and one unopened bud. As the holy prophet fell through the air, the bud burst suddenly into bloom, and on its snowy petals softly sank the one who was to give to more than 1/3 of the world a faith far better than any they had known. The raised center of the lotus even now is called utena, which means seat, and lotus blossoms, either natural or artificial, are always before every Buddhist shrine. Just before sunset we were all ready, for twilight was the hour of welcome. Oshorai-sama was always spoken of as a vague, impersonal figure who came riding on a snow-white steed from the land of darkness, the shores of the unknown, the place of the dead. Like all children, I had always looked forward with pleasure to the visit of the ancestors, but after Father's death, I felt a deep personal interest, and my heart was beating with excitement as the family met at the shrine. Each one, even the servants, wore a new dress, simple and inexpensive, but new. As twilight deepened, the shrine lantern was lighted, the shoji pushed back, and the entrance doors opened, thus leaving a free path from the outside road all the way to the shrine. Then we started, walking 2 by 2, through the open door, across the hall, down the steps of the shoe-off place, and along the stone walk to the big entrance gates, which were open wide. In the centre of the gateway, Gia had crisscrossed a little pile of hemp stems, just 13, around a tiny heap of fluffy dried grass. When we reached this, we parted, Gia and Yoshita going to one side of the path, and on the other, Honourable Grandmother, Mother, myself, and Ishi, Kin, and Toshi. Then, all respectfully stooping, we bowed our heads and waited. Brother was in Tokyo, so honoured Grandmother, with Ishi's help, struck the fire of purity with flint and steel, and the dropping sparks lighted the hemp stems into a blaze of welcome. All the town was silent and dusky, except for hundreds of tiny fires, for one was blazing at every gateway. As I bowed, my longing heart seemed to pull my father to me. Through the distance, I could hear the sound of soft galloping feet, and I knew the snow-white steed was nearing. The moment's blaze of the hemp stem fire was dying. A faint breath of warm August wind struck my cheek, and peace crept into my heart. Slowly we rose, and with bowed heads walked back on the outside edges of the path, 2 by 2, but wide apart, leaving the sacred space of the walk between. When we reached the shrine, Mother struck the gong, and we all bowed with the dignified cheerfulness of our usual greeting to a welcome guest. We seemed so few since even the year before, and how cordially our hearts welcomed the presence which we knew would bring into our home cheerful companionship for the happy and helpful comfort for the sorrowful. The next 2 days the town was full of lanterns. Everybody carried one. Every house was decorated with them. Every street was lined with them, and at night the cemeteries were filled with the glowworm lights. For every grave had above it tiny white lanterns swinging from an arch made from stems of pampas grass. It was a happy time for all Japan, and the one day in the year when no life was taken of fish, fowl, or even insect. The fishermen idly wandered about, arrayed in holiday garments. The chickens cackled and crowed in their bamboo cages, and the little crickets, which children love to keep in tiny cages, sang their shrill song in the trees without the approach of a single sticky-topped pole. And charity extended loving arms to the farthest limit. No priest parts with an empty begging bowl. Pampas-woven baskets of food were hidden beneath lotus leaves on the graves, waiting for the poor to carry away when the bon lights had burned out. And even the sinners in hell, if their hearts longed for salvation, were given another chance during the merciful days of Bon. Our home was filled with an atmosphere of pleasant thoughts, unselfish acts, and happy laughter, for we felt that our kind guests enjoyed our simple pleasures of new clothes, company courtesies, and our daily feasts with them of the shrine food, consisting of fruits, vegetables, and rice dumplings. Honourable grandmother's face grew more peaceful each hour. Mothers beamed with calm content. The servants were chattering and smiling all the time, and my heart was filled with quiet joy. In the shadows before sunrise of the fourth day, Gia went for lotus blossoms, and Mother placed fresh food before the shrine. When the brightening air outside began to quarrel with the soft white lantern inside, we gathered for the farewell. The past days had been happy ones, and I think we all felt sad when, after the last deep bows, Mother rose and lifted the pampas mat from before the shrine. She doubled and flattened it, then tied the ends with grass, thus forming a rude little canoe, and fixed a hemp stem arch to the centre. The lotus leaf dishes of food were placed within, and some bowls of rice and uncooked dough added, as Oshorai-sama's gift to the birds. Then the little vegetable animals and all the decorations of the shrine were put in, the white fluttering lantern was swung from the arch, and with Gia carrying the little canoe, Mother and I, followed by Ishi and Toshi, went to the river. Morning was just dawning, but the streets were full of people and the air crowded with circling birds who seemed to know that a treat was before them. When we reached the bank, all except Gia took their places on the bridge and watched him make his way down the slippery steps cut in the bank and join the throng below. Each person was holding a little canoe with its burden of food and tiny swinging lantern. "Look," whispered Ishi, as Gia lifted his hands to strike the flint and steel to light our little lantern. "Our honourable ancestors will embark on the first tide warmed by the sunrise." The silence was unbroken except for the loud cries of birds. Then a sudden ray of sunlight shot across the distant mountain, and hundreds of figures stooped and launched their little canoes. All stood watching as they whirled and drifted along in the midst of the storm of darting birds, screaming their thanks. One upset. "My, Shorai-sama has stepped off and is now in the unknown land," said an old lady, and waiting no longer she climbed the bank and contentedly made her way home. As daylight brightened, we could see the little boats far in the distance rising and falling, the tiny white lanterns swinging back and forth. We waited until the sun broke into brilliance. Then, as the light came racing down the mountainside, a soft deep murmur rose from the bowing figures all along the length of the shore. "Farewell, O Shorai-sama," we all gently called. "Come again next year. We will be waiting to welcome you." The crowd scattered, and with satisfied faces made their way homeward. Mother and I walked happily along with Ishi, Toshi, and Gia, chatting pleasantly behind us. The anxious look that Mother's face had lost during the last days did not come back, and I felt that Father had really been with us, bringing comfort and help to us all, and now he had gone, leaving behind him not loneliness, but peace. That afternoon, Ishi was putting away my flower hair ornament. She pointed to the shield of polished silver set in the midst of the flowers. A crest was carved deeply in it, and the cut edges sparkled like jewels. "It is not the Inagaki crest," I said. "No, it is the birth crest of Honorable Yido grandmother," said she, closing the little box and putting it away. "It is very wonderful work. Everything Honorable Yido grandmother has ever given you is especially beautiful or rare." "Honorable Yido grandmother never sends a gift to my father or to my mother," I said. "No, to no one but you," she replied. "She always remembers you on the festival to welcome and honor the ancestors of the Inagaki." I remembered long afterwards that faint wonder passed through my mind at that time that I should be the one member of the family who ever received a gift from Honorable Yido grandmother, but it lasted only a moment. A Japanese child rarely asks what was not told, and there were so many taken for granted things in Japanese life anyway that I gave the matter no further thought. Not until I was grown did I learn that Honorable Yido grandmother was my father's own mother, and that my dear Honorable grandmother, to whom I owed so much, was in reality my great-grandmother. When my grandfather died suddenly, leaving father at the age of 7 as his heir, Honorable grandmother became the mistress of her dead son's home and the mother of his child. That the young widow, father's mother, did not remain in her own home was one of the tragedies of our family system, which, wise as it was when made, has resulted in many wrongs, as must always be the case when the world moves too swiftly and customs slowly lag behind. The restoration of 1868 was not a sudden event. There had been political agitation for years in which the world of Japan was divided into two factions, those who believed that the imperial power should include both sacred and secular duties, and those who believed the shogun, as military ruler, should take all national burdens from the shoulders of the sacred emperor. My grandfather believed in the restoration of imperial power, but his wife's father, being a Hamamoto, bodyguard of the shogun, was of course a strong advocate of the opposing party. Personally, the two men were friends, but each was strongly loyal to his own principles and to his overlord. Grandfather's death took place very suddenly when he was in Tokyo, then called Yedo, on official duty. It is said that he was taken violently and mysteriously ill just after being elaborately entertained at the mansion of his father-in-law. At the feast were present a number of ardent politicians. That my grandfather understood the political significance of the gathering was shown when, after his death, it was discovered that he had gone to the feast wearing beneath his usual ceremonial dress his white death robe. In those days, when the heart of Japan was beating violently, and she was pushing hard against the set but questioned control of ages, such an event was not so unusual, nor was my grandfather's quiet acceptance of his fate so rare. It was only samurai loyalty to a cause and samurai bravery in accepting defeat. Standards differ in different countries, but everywhere we are expected to be loyal and to be brave. But the tragedy of it came to the girl wife, my grandmother, who was little more than 20 years old when she became a widow. Under ordinary circumstances, she would have been the honoured widow mother of the 7-year-old heir, my father, but because of the well-understood, though outwardly ignored situation, there was but one thing for this proud, deeply humiliated woman to do. Whether she was the sacrifice of her father's ambition or of his loyalty, I do not know, but she humbly advocated from her husband's family, and changing her name Inagaki to the death name, returned to her former home. According to the ideals of the time, this was the most dishonoured position that any samurai woman could hold. It was scorned as would be that of a soldier who goes bravely to the battlefield and cowardly returns home before fighting has begun. For a few years, the young widow lived a quiet life in her father's home, devoting her life to classic literature and cultural attainments. Then she was offered an important position as lady official in the mansion of the daimyo of Satsuma. This was just at the time when Satsuma was playing a conspicuous part in history. It was this daimyate which single-handed challenged the entire British Eastern Squadron after the young samurai of the clan had killed Mr. Richardson, a British merchant who boldly crossed the ceremonial procession of their overlord. Satsuma was the most powerful daimyo in Japan, and his home, like all high-rank houses during feudal days, was divided into two distinct departments, the state and the home. The government of the home department was entirely under lady officials, and in large mansions with many retainers, these lady officers had to be efficient as the officials of the state department. Among these able retainers, my grandmother occupied an honoured place. Very soon her special gifts were recognised, and she was chosen as governess to the little girl princess, a position which she held until her charge became a bride-elect and required teachers for wifehood training. Then my grandmother, generously pensioned for life, was honourably released. This farewell being poetically worded, the regretted disappearance of the full moon behind folds of cloud, leaving in her wake soft, wide-spreading shafts of light to remain with us always as gentle and lasting memories. I never saw Honourable Yido grandmother with my human eyes, but I can see her always when I look into my heart. Living in the largest daimyo mansion in Japan, surrounded by wealth and luxury in the midst of daily expressed appreciation of her culture and her natural gifts, and with the respect and affection of her much-loved young princess always with her, yet her thoughts turned to the little granddaughter whom she never saw. It was not altogether the call of love, though I like to think that was there also. She was groping over a new and puzzling path, striving to find a way to keep faithful to her wifely vow. Her life work, through no fault or neglect of her own, had been taken from her, but unflinchingly, as the samurai way, she held her broken duty to her heart, and, as long as she lived, sent each year one of her closest personal possessions to the little granddaughter, who was said to resemble her, even to her curly hair, to be worn in a welcome greeting to the spirits of the Inagaki family, to whom she could no longer bow, but to whom her duty was due. Her helplessness was tragedy, her efforts were pathos, but to her best and to her last she was true. Standards of duty differ on opposite sides of the world, but Japanese people never flinch at its call. Many a boy and girl not yet in their teens, many a man and woman at the time of brightest promise, many of the aged have gone alone to a distant province, and among strangers have become of them, body, brain, and spirit. But even among beautiful surroundings, if duty lies behind undone, nothing, while life lasts, can break the heart pull, the brain planning, the soul prayer to reach, even partially, the lost goal. Such is the deep hidden soul of Japan. When the young princess bade farewell to my grandmother, she presented her as the highest token of grateful and affectionate appreciation, something which she herself had worn, a dress bearing her own crest. Many years afterwards, for the Bon Festival, when I was 10 years old, my grandmother sent this choice treasure to me. I well remember that day. Ishi had taken me to my room to dress for the evening of welcome. Hanging over one of the large lacquer frames on which we spread our clothing to air or to wait until we were ready was a beautiful summer dress of pale blue linen, decorated with an exquisite design of the 7 grasses of autumn. It seemed to me the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my life. "Oh, Ishi," I cried, "is this beautiful dress for me?" "Yes, Etsubo-sama. Honourable Yido grandmother has sent it to you for the festival." It was too large for me, and Toshi had to take deep tucks at the shoulder and waist. When I dressed, I went to show myself to Honourable grandmother and mother. Then I went to father's room. "I have come," I announced, kneeling outside the closed door, ready to open it. "Enter," came the response from within. I pushed back the shoji. Father was reading. He looked up with a smile. Then, what was my surprise to see him, after one glance at me, quickly slip from his cushion and with slow dignity dramatically announce, "Enter the Princess of Satsuma." Then he made a deep bow. Of course, my own little head was down on the floor in an instant, and though when I lifted it he was laughing, still I felt in some subtle way that there was something deeper beneath his smile than just his humorous obeisance to the crest of a superior clan. A combined pride and grief, and perhaps pain also, like the cruel ache in the heart of a strong man whose sword arm is helpless. End of part 5. If you are enjoying our audiobooks, please take the time to subscribe, press like, make a comment, or share this audiobook station with other friends who also enjoy listening. Thank you.